The bitter Carpathian wind howled through the remote Romanian mountains, carrying with it the scent of ancient earth and forgotten secrets. Dr. Peter Stern pulled his jacket tighter as he stared at the massive stone doors emerging from the excavation site, carved deep into the mountainside. After 3 months of careful digging through layers of rock and soil that seemed to whisper warnings with every shovelful removed, they had finally reached what appeared to be the entrance to something far older than anything in the historical record. The site itself defied explanation. Located in a valley so remote that their GPS had given up trying to maintain a signal, the excavation lay hidden beneath centuries of landslides and deliberate concealment. Local villagers from the nearest settlement, some 40 miles away, had warned them against coming here. They spoke in hushed tones of a place where shepherds' dogs refused to go, where birds fell silent, and where the very ground seemed to pulse with malevolent energy during the darkest hours of night. "This doesn't make sense," Peter muttered, running his weathered hands over the intricate carvings that covered the towering stone barriers. The symbols were unlike anything he'd encountered in 20 years of biblical archaeology. They seemed to writhe and shift in his peripheral vision, as if the ancient stone itself was alive and breathing. The craftsmanship was impossibly precise, each line cut with mathematical perfection that would challenge modern tools, let alone whatever primitive instruments should have existed when this was created. The doors themselves were massive, easily 20 feet tall and 12 feet wide, hewn from a single piece of black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was smooth as glass in some places, rough and deliberately scarred in others, creating a pattern that hurt to look at directly. Peter had spent hours trying to identify the material, but it matched nothing in his geological references. It was heavier than granite, darker than obsidian, and cold to the touch even during the warmest part of the day. Chris Cole approached, his military boots crunching on the loose mountain stone and ancient pottery shards that littered the excavation site. The former demolitions expert had seen his share of bunkers and fortifications during his time in the Balkans, but nothing like this. His trained eye immediately picked up details that the academics had missed. "Doc, these doors, they're not meant to keep people out. Look at the way they're designed. The reinforcements, the locking mechanisms. They're all on the inside." "What are you saying?" Peter asked, though a cold dread was already settling in his stomach like a living thing. "I'm saying these doors were built to keep something in, and whoever built them was scared as hell of whatever's behind them." Chris pointed to the intricate system of bronze and iron bars that they'd uncovered on the inner side of the doors. The metal showed signs of tremendous stress, bent, twisted, and in some places completely shattered, as if something had repeatedly thrown itself against the barriers with incredible force. Scratch marks gouged deep into the stone suggested claws or talons of enormous size, and dark stains that had resisted all their cleaning attempts hinted at struggles too violent to imagine. Professor Roddy Whitmore emerged from the command tent, his aged frame moving with surprising urgency. The company founder's face was pale beneath his weathered skin, and his hands trembled slightly as he approached the excavation site. The old man had been acting strangely for the past week, ever since they'd begun uncovering the upper chambers. He barely slept, spent hours poring over ancient texts that he kept locked in a metal case, and had taken to muttering prayers in languages that predated Latin. "Peter, we need to proceed with extreme caution," Whitmore said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that made everyone stop what they were doing. "The translations from the upper chambers, they're not what we expected. Not what we hoped for." Amy Ragsdale looked up from her forensic equipment, her young face creased with concern. At 28, she was the youngest member of the team, but her expertise in forensic anthropology had already earned her recognition from universities across Europe. Her workstation was a nightmare of catalogued bone fragments, soil samples, and photographic evidence that painted a disturbing picture of the site's history. "Professor, I've been analyzing the bone fragments from the antechamber," she said, gesturing to a table covered with carefully arranged specimens. "The carbon dating is impossible. These remains predate any known civilization by thousands of years. But that's not the strangest part." "What is?" Peter asked, dreading the answer, but needing to hear it. "The skeletal structure. It's human, but wrong. Extended canine teeth, elongated finger bones, and the rib cages are expanded, as if the lungs were designed to hold far more air than necessary, or something else entirely." Amy picked up a skull fragment and pointed to the eye sockets. Look at this. The orbital cavities are nearly twice the size of modern humans, and there are additional bone structures here that don't match any known anatomy. She moved to another specimen, a complete femur that was too long, too thick, and marked with strange hollow channels running through the bone itself. And this, I've never seen anything like it. It's as if these weren't entirely human. Or maybe they were human once, but something changed them. The mountain wind picked up, carrying with it a strange metallic scent that made Peter's skin crawl. The massive doors stood before them like sentinels, their surface covered in warnings written in languages that shouldn't exist. As the afternoon light began to fade, the carvings seemed to move more actively, creating an optical illusion that made the ancient warnings appear to pulse with their own inner life. Peter had identified at least 12 different scripts on the doors, ranging from Proto-Sumerian to symbols that predated any known writing system. But the message was consistent across all languages. Warnings about sleep, about blood, about things that should never be awakened. One inscription, carved deeper than the rest and filled with a dark substance that might once have been paint or blood, repeated the same phrase in multiple tongues. Let not the children of night walk again in flesh. The company didn't send us here to study biblical history, did they? Peter asked Whitmore, his voice barely above a whisper. The elderly professor's eyes were haunted as he shook his head. No, son. We were sent here because certain entities have been stirring. Ancient things that were locked away for good reason. Our job isn't just to discover the truth. It's to make sure some truths stay buried. Whitmore pulled out a leather-bound journal that Peter had never seen before. The pages were filled with photocopies of documents in various languages, official seals from organizations Peter didn't recognize, and what appeared to be satellite imagery of similar sites around the world. There are 12 locations like this one, Peter. 12 prisons scattered across the globe, each one sealed by different civilizations at different times, but all of them serving the same purpose. Which is? Containing things that should never have existed in the first place. Chris ran his hands along the door's edge, searching for structural weaknesses and trying to understand the locking mechanism. The bronze fittings were covered in a patina that spoke of incredible age, but they seemed functional, as if they'd been maintained by some unseen hand over the centuries. His fingers caught on a sharp protrusion near the base of the door, and he jerked back with a curse. A thin line of blood welled up on his palm. "Careful," Amy warned, but it was too late. A single drop of Chris's blood fell from his wounded hand, landing on the ancient stone near the base of the doors. The moment it touched the carved surface, something changed. The air itself seemed to thicken, taking on a quality that made breathing difficult. A low rumble emanated from deep within the mountain, so deep that they felt it in their bones rather than heard it with their ears. "Did anyone else feel that?" Peter asked, his archaeological instincts screaming danger. The blood on the stone began to spread, seeping into microscopic cracks in the ancient surface and disappearing as if the stone itself was drinking it. The symbols around the door frame started to glow with a faint phosphorescent light that had nothing to do with the dying sunlight. The glow was wrong somehow, not the warm light of fire or electricity, but something cold and hungry that seemed to pull at their vision. The stone doors began to shift, ancient mechanisms grinding to life after millennia of silence. Dust and debris cascaded from the towering barriers as they slowly, inexorably began to part. The sound was like the mountain itself was groaning in pain, a grinding shriek of stone against metal that set their teeth on edge and made their hearts race with primal fear. "Nobody move," Whitmore commanded, his voice sharp with authority. But it was too late. The doors were opening, revealing a corridor that stretched into absolute darkness beyond. A fetid wind rushed out from the depths, carrying with it the smell of decay and something else. Something that made Peter's primitive brain scream warnings about predators and death. The air that emerged from the tomb was wrong, thicker than it should be, and it carried sounds that might have been whispers, or might have been the settling of ancient stone. But beneath those sounds was something else, a rhythmic pulsing, like the beating of an enormous heart. The team stood frozen as the massive doors completed their agonizing journey, standing open like the jaws of some primordial beast. The corridor beyond was perfectly carved, its walls smooth and covered with more of the strange symbols. But unlike the warnings on the outer doors, these inscriptions seemed to be instructions, or perhaps prayers. "We need to go in," Peter said. Peter, though every fiber of his being rebelled against the idea. "Whatever's down there, it's been sealed for thousands of years. We need to document it before..." "Before what?" Amy interrupted, her voice tight with fear. "Before something else finds it," Whitmore said quietly. "Or before it finds us." Chris pulled out a high-powered flashlight and aimed it into the corridor. The beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness after only a few feet, as if the very air was drinking the light. The walls were carved from the same dark stone as the doors, but they were covered in relief sculptures that told a story in images too disturbing to fully comprehend. Figures in robes knelt before towering shapes that hurt to look at directly. Armies fled from creatures with too many limbs and faces that defied geometry. "I don't like this, Doc," Chris said, his military training warring with scientific curiosity. "My gut's telling me we should seal this place back up and walk away." "We can't," Peter replied, pulling on his headlamp and checking his equipment. "This could be the archaeological find of the century, maybe the millennium. If there really is something pre-biblical down there, something that predates Christianity itself." "That's exactly why we should leave it alone," Amy said, but she was already gathering her equipment. As they prepared to enter the corridor, Peter noticed something that made his blood run cold. The symbols carved around the doorframe weren't just warnings, they were instructions. And as his knowledge of ancient languages slowly pieced together their meaning, he realized they weren't meant to keep people out. They were meant to keep something in, and that something was beginning to wake up. The corridor stretched before them like the throat of some ancient leviathan, its walls pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm that seemed to match the beating of their own hearts. Peter led the team deeper into the mountain, their footsteps echoing in ways that defied the laws of acoustics. Each sound seemed to multiply and distort, creating phantom whispers that followed them through the darkness. The air grew thicker with every step, laden with the weight of centuries and something else, an oppressive presence that made their skin crawl and their nerves sing with tension. Peter's headlamp beam cut through the gloom, revealing more of the disturbing relief carvings that covered every surface. The images told a story that no textbook had ever recorded, depicting events that predated human civilization by millennia. "Jesus Christ," Chris muttered, stopping before a section of wall that showed robed figures performing what could only be described as sacrificial rituals. But the victims weren't human. They were the elongated, wrong-shaped creatures whose bones Amy had been cataloging. "Are those things... are they what we found in the antechamber?" Amy approached with her camera, documenting everything despite her trembling hands. "The anatomical similarities are unmistakable, but look at this sequence here." She pointed to a series of carvings that showed the creatures in different states, first as normal humans, then gradually transforming into something else entirely. It's like they're showing a process, a change. Peter studied the images more closely, his mind racing to process what he was seeing. The transformation depicted wasn't random or natural. It was deliberate, controlled, orchestrated by the robed figures who appeared throughout the carvings. In the final panels, the transformed creatures knelt before a central figure, whose face had been deliberately carved away, leaving only a smooth depression where features should have been. "Professor Whitmore," Peter called back to the elderly man who was trailing behind them. His breathing labored in the thick air. "You need to see this. These aren't just religious murals, they're instructions, a manual." Whitmore approached slowly, his face grave as he examined the carvings. His hands shook as he traced certain symbols with his finger, and Peter noticed that the old man's lips were moving in what might have been prayers or incantations. "Yes," Whitmore whispered. "Instructions for creating an army, for changing the very nature of human flesh and blood." The corridor began to widen as they progressed deeper into the mountain. The ceiling rose higher, disappearing into darkness that their lights couldn't penetrate. Strange architectural features became visible, alcoves carved into the walls, each one sized and shaped to hold a human body. But these weren't burial niches. The walls around each alcove were stained with substances that had long since dried to a rust-colored crust. "How many are there?" Amy asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she counted the alcoves stretching into the distance. I've counted over 200 so far, Chris replied, his military training automatically cataloging potential threats. And that's just on one side of the corridor. Peter felt his stomach turn as the implications hit him. This wasn't a tomb or a temple. It was a barracks. A holding facility designed to house hundreds, perhaps thousands, of the transformed creatures. The alcoves weren't for the dead. They were for the sleeping. The corridor opened into a vast circular chamber that defied belief. The space was enormous, easily 300 feet across, with a domed ceiling that stretched up into absolute darkness. The walls were lined with alcoves, tier upon tier of them rising up the curved walls like some nightmare amphitheater. And in each alcove, barely visible in the gloom, was a figure. My God, Peter breathed, his light playing across the nearest figures. They were desiccated, mummified by the dry air and countless centuries of stillness. But unlike Egyptian mummies, these hadn't been prepared for burial. They sat upright in their alcoves, arms at their sides, faces turned toward the center of the chamber, as if eternally watching and waiting. Amy's camera flash illuminated a section of the wall, revealing the creatures in stark detail. They had once been human. That much was clear from their basic skeletal structure. But something had changed them, twisted them into something else. Their limbs were too long, their fingers extended into claw-like appendages, and their faces were elongated, with jaws that protruded in ways that suggested they were designed for tearing flesh rather than speaking words. They're all facing the center, Chris observed, sweeping his flashlight across the chamber. Like they're waiting for something, or someone. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, accessible by stairs carved directly into the stone floor. The platform was circular, perhaps 30 feet across, and in its center was a sarcophagus, unlike anything Peter had ever seen. It was massive, easily 10 feet long and 4 feet wide, and carved from the same dark stone as the doors. But unlike the alcoves around the chamber, this central tomb was covered in symbols that seemed to move and shift in the light. "That's where we need to go," Whitmore said, his voice carrying a note of inevitability that chilled Peter to the bone. "Professor, with all due respect, I think we should document what we can from here and then get the hell out," Chris said. "This place, it's not right. Every instinct I have is telling me we're in danger. We can't leave. Not yet." Whitmore pulled out his leather journal and began comparing symbols from the central sarcophagus with notes he'd made. "Peter, you need to understand. This isn't just an archaeological discovery. It's a warning. A record of something that happened before and could happen again." As they descended the stairs toward the central platform, Peter noticed that the air was growing warmer. The oppressive coldness of the mountain was being replaced by something else, a heat that seemed to come from within the stone itself. The symbols on the sarcophagus were becoming more visible, glowing faintly with the same phosphorescent light they'd seen on the doors. "The inscriptions," Amy whispered, her voice filled with academic excitement despite her fear. "They're in multiple languages again, but the central text... Professor, can you read this?" Whitmore approached the sarcophagus slowly, his eyes scanning the ancient text. His face went completely white as he read, and Peter could see his hands beginning to shake uncontrollably. "It's not what we thought," he said finally. "The figure buried here, he's not a king or a priest or a prophet." "Then what is he?" Peter demanded. "He's a jailer, the keeper of the damned. And according to this, he's not dead. He's sleeping, waiting." The temperature in the chamber continued to rise, and Peter realized that the heat was coming directly from the sarcophagus itself. The stone was warm to the touch, pulsing with the same rhythm they'd been hearing since entering the tomb. It wasn't their imagination. Something inside was alive, and it was responding to their presence. "Waiting for what?" Chris asked, though his military training was already telling him to prepare for the worst. Whitmore's voice was barely audible as he read from the inscriptions. "For blood. For the awakening. For the signal to release his army and reclaim the world that was taken from him." As if responding to the old man's words, the sarcophagus began to change. The stone lid, which had appeared to be sealed permanently in place, started to shift. Ancient mechanisms hidden within the platform groaned to life, and Peter could see gaps beginning to appear around the edges of the lid. "We need to leave, now." Chris grabbed Amy's arm and started pulling her toward the stairs. "Whatever's happening here, we don't want to be around for it." But it was too late. The drops of Chris's blood from earlier had done more than just open the doors. They had begun a process that couldn't be stopped. The sarcophagus lid continued to move, rising slowly but inexorably, revealing darkness within that seemed deeper and more absolute than anything they'd encountered. From that darkness came a sound that froze their blood, a long, slow intake of breath, followed by an exhalation that carried with it the scent of decay and something indefinably wrong. And then, from the depths of the sarcophagus, came a voice. It spoke in a language that predated human speech, words that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the primitive parts of their brains. But somehow, impossibly, they understood. The voice was ancient beyond measure, filled with power and intelligence and a hunger that had been growing for millennia. "Who disturbs my slumber?" the voice asked, and the very stones of the chamber seemed to vibrate with each word. "Who brings the gift of blood to awaken the faithful?" A figure began to rise from within the sarcophagus. It had once been human, but like the desiccated army surrounding them, it had been changed into something else. It was tall, easily 7 feet, with limbs that were too long, and a face that was both beautiful and terrible. Its skin was pale as moonlight, stretched tight over bones that were arranged in ways that human anatomy had never intended. Its eyes opened, revealing orbs of absolute darkness that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. When it looked at them, Peter felt as if his very soul was being examined and found wanting. "Mortals," the figure said, its voice now speaking perfect English, though Peter was certain it was reading the language directly from their minds. "How long have I slept? How long have my children waited in darkness?" Amy couldn't contain her scientific curiosity despite her terror. "Who are you? What are you?" The figure stepped out of the sarcophagus with fluid grace, its movements too smooth and controlled to be entirely human. "I am what your kind called the Messiah, though that was never my true purpose. I am the one who was chosen to guard the threshold between your world and the realm of eternal hunger." "Guard it from what?" Peter asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. The figure gestured to the army of desiccated creatures surrounding them. "From them. From the children of darkness who would consume your world if given the chance. I am their jailer, their keeper, their eternal warden." Whitmore stepped forward, his journal clutched to his chest like a shield. "Then why are you awakening them? Why are you breaking your own prison?" The figure's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "Because, old man, I have grown tired of my duty. Millennia of solitude, of maintaining the barriers, of holding back the tide of darkness, all while your kind prospers and forgets the sacrifices made for their safety." The creature that had once been called the Messiah began to walk among the alcoves, running its elongated fingers along the desiccated forms of its army. Where it touched them, they began to change. Color returned to their mummified flesh, and their hollow eye sockets began to glow with the same dark light as their masters. "They require blood to fully awaken," the Messiah explained, as if conducting a lecture on natural history. "Your blood, specifically. The blood of the living, freely given or taken by force. Each drop will restore one of my faithful to their former glory." Chris raised his weapon, though he suspected it would do little good against creatures that had already been dead for centuries. "We're not giving you anything." "Oh, but you already have," the Messiah replied with a smile that revealed teeth like shards of black glass. "Your blood opened the doors. Your blood awakened me, and your blood will resurrect my army." The figure gestured, and the alcoves throughout the chamber began to pulse with increasing intensity. The desiccated creatures were stirring, their mummified forms beginning to twitch and move as ancient magic flowed through their dried veins. "You see," the Messiah continued, "I have decided that humanity has had its chance. You have proven yourselves unworthy of the gift of life, unworthy of the protection I have provided. It is time for a new order, a darker age, where my children shall inherit the earth." Peter realized with growing horror that they weren't just witnesses to an archaeological discovery. They were present at the beginning of the end of the world, The creature before them wasn't humanity's savior, it was humanity's executioner, and it was preparing to unleash an army of horrors that had been held in check for thousands of years. The first of the mummified creatures opened its eyes, and Amy Ragsdale screamed. Amy's scream echoed through the vast chamber, reverberating off the stone walls and seeming to energize the awakening creatures even further. The first of the desiccated figures had opened its eyes, revealing orbs of crimson fire that burned with an intelligence older than civilization. Its movements were jerky at first, like a marionette being manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. But with each passing second, it became more fluid, more alive. "Run!" Chris shouted, grabbing Amy's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. But as they reached the edge of the platform, they discovered that their escape route had been cut off. More creatures were stirring in the alcoves near the entrance, their ancient forms blocking the corridor that led back to the surface. Peter's mind raced as he watched the nightmare unfold around them. The chamber had become a maze of awakening horrors, each one requiring blood to complete its resurrection. The Messiah stood at the center of it all, conducting his symphony of darkness with gestures that seemed to pull life from the very air itself. "There has to be another way out," Peter said, spinning in a circle as he searched the chamber walls for any sign of an alternate exit. "These places always have multiple passages, emergency routes." "You're thinking like an archaeologist, Doc," Chris replied, his weapon trained on the nearest stirring creature. "These things aren't human anymore. They don't think about fire exits and building codes." Professor Whitmore stood frozen at the base of the sarcophagus, his journal still clutched in his trembling hands. His face had gone completely pale, and his lips were moving in what might have been prayer or incantation. The elderly man seemed to be in some kind of trance, staring at the Messiah with a mixture of terror and recognition. "Professor!" Peter called out. "Whitmore! We need to move!" But the old man didn't respond. Instead, he began to speak in a voice that was his own, but somehow different, older and more authoritative. "I know what you are," he said to the Messiah. "I know what you really are, and I know why you were imprisoned here." The Messiah turned its attention to Whitmore, and Peter could see something like surprise flicker across its inhuman features. "Ah," it said with a voice like grinding stone. "One who remembers. One who carries the old knowledge. How inconvenient." "You're not the Messiah," Whitmore continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You never were. You're one of the Nephilim, aren't you? One of the fallen ones. The children of angels and mortals who sought to corrupt the world before the great flood." The creature's laugh was like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. "Such crude names you give us. But yes, old man, I am what your kind calls Nephilim, though we prefer our true designation, the Inheritors. We were meant to rule this world, to guide humanity into a darker age of worship and sacrifice. But we were betrayed by our own kind, imprisoned by those who feared our power." Around the chamber, more of the desiccated army was stirring to life. Their movements were becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. Peter could see that they retained some remnant of human intelligence, but it had been twisted and corrupted by whatever transformation had created them. They were no longer human, but they remembered being human, and that memory filled them with a hatred for everything they had lost. "The company," Peter said suddenly, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "The 12 sites around the world. You knew about this. You knew what we'd find here." Whitmore nodded slowly, never taking his eyes off the Messiah. "The Order of Sacred Mysteries has been guarding these sites for over 1,000 years. We've been watching, waiting, making sure that the seals remained intact. But we knew that eventually, someone would find a way to break them." "Then why didn't you stop us?" Amy demanded, her voice shrill with panic as she watched more creatures awakening around them. "Because," Whitmore replied, pulling something from his jacket that Peter had never seen before, a device that looked like a cross between a detonator and an ancient religious artifact. "Sometimes the only way to destroy evil is to let it reveal itself completely." The Messiah's eyes widened as it recognized the device in Whitmore's hands. "No," it snarled. "You wouldn't dare. The knowledge that would be lost, the history that would be destroyed. Knowledge that should never have existed in the first place," Whitmore replied firmly. history that was meant to stay buried. Peter understood what the old man was planning, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. "Professor, if you detonate charges in here, we'll all be killed. The entire mountain will come down." "I know," Whitmore said quietly. "But if these creatures escape, if they reach the surface and begin their work of transformation, millions will die. The choice is simple: 4 lives, or the future of humanity." Chris moved closer to the professor, his military training kicking in. "How long do we have?" "The charges are already in place," Whitmore explained. "I installed them weeks ago, when we first discovered the outer doors. The blast will be sufficient to bring down the entire chamber, sealing these creatures forever." The Messiah let out a roar of rage that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It raised its hands, and the awakening process of its army accelerated dramatically. Creatures that had been stirring slowly began to move with purpose, their dried flesh filling out as some unknown energy restored them to a semblance of life. "You cannot stop what has already begun," the Messiah declared. "Even if you destroy this place, there are others. 11 more sites, 11 more armies waiting to be awakened. My death will serve only to alert my brethren that the time of hiding is over." "Maybe," Whitmore acknowledged. "But it will buy humanity time to prepare. Time to remember the old ways, the old protections." One of the newly awakened creatures lunged at Amy, moving with inhuman speed and grace. Chris intercepted it, his combat knife slicing through its neck in a motion that should have been fatal. But the creature merely stumbled, black ichor flowing from the wound instead of blood, and continued its attack. "They don't die like normal things," Chris shouted, grappling with the creature as its claws raked across his body armor. "Whatever's animating them, it's not dependent on normal biology." Peter grabbed a piece of broken stone from the platform and brought it down on the creature's skull with all his strength. The impact sent cracked spiderwebbing across the thing's face, but it continued to fight with undiminished ferocity. "The blood," Amy said suddenly, her scientific mind working even in the midst of terror. "They need fresh blood to complete the transformation. That's why they're not fully restored yet. They're running on whatever energy the Messiah is providing, but they need more to become truly alive again." "Then we don't give them any," Peter replied, helping Chris force the creature away from Amy. But even as he spoke, Peter could see that their situation was becoming hopeless. More creatures were awakening every second, and they were being surrounded. The Messiah itself was beginning to change, its already inhuman form stretching and distorting as it called upon powers that had been dormant for millennia. "Professor," Chris called out as he fought off another attacker, "whatever you're going to do it now." Whitmore looked at each of them in turn, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for bringing you here, for lying to you about our true purpose. But I want you to know that your sacrifice will not be forgotten." "Wait," Peter said, a desperate idea forming in his mind. "There might be another way. The transformation process. It requires blood, right? But what if we could reverse it? What if instead of giving them our blood, we could take theirs?" Amy's eyes widened as she understood what Peter was suggesting. "The sarcophagus," she said. "It's not just a tomb, it's a focusing point. If we could somehow reverse the energy flow..." The Messiah heard their conversation and let out another roar of rage. "You understand nothing of the forces you meddle with," it snarled. "The power that flows through this place is beyond your comprehension. To attempt to reverse it would require a sacrifice of unimaginable proportions." "What kind of sacrifice?" Peter asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "A life freely given," Whitmore said, his voice heavy with the weight of ancient knowledge. "Someone would have to place themselves at the center of the reversal, would have to allow the energy to flow through them instead of into the creatures." The professor looked down at the device in his hands, then at the awakening army surrounding them. "But there's no guarantee it would work. The explosion is certain. It will stop them here and now." "But it won't stop the others," Peter replied. "You said there are 11 more sites. If we can learn how to reverse the process here, we might be able to stop them all." Chris dispatched another creature with a blow that should have shattered its spine, but it continued to move even as its body fell apart. Whatever we're going to do, we need to decide fast. These things are getting stronger, and there are more of them every second. Amy was studying the sarcophagus, her archaeological training overriding her fear. The symbols around the base, they're not just decorative. They're part of a larger pattern, a geometric design that focuses energy toward the center. Peter joined her, running his hands over the carved symbols while dodging attacks from the awakening creatures. If we could somehow reverse the polarity, change the direction of the energy flow, it would require someone to take the Messiah's place, Whitmore said. Someone would have to become the focal point, the conduit for all that power. The Messiah itself was advancing on them now, its form continuing to change and distort as it drew power from the awakening of its army. You delay the inevitable, it said, its voice now echoing from multiple directions at once. Submit to your fate, and I will make your death swift. Like hell, Chris replied, emptying his sidearm into the creature's center mass. The bullets passed through it without effect, disappearing into the shadows that now comprised much of its form. Peter made his decision. I'll do it, he said, moving toward the center of the sarcophagus. I'll become the focal point. No, Amy said, grabbing his arm. You don't understand the forces involved. The energy required to reverse this process would burn you out from the inside. Then we're back to the professor's plan, Chris said grimly. Blow the place and hope for the best. But as they argued, Amy was still studying the symbols around the sarcophagus. Her eyes widened as she made a connection. Wait, she said. There's something else. Look at this sequence here. It's not just about reversing the energy flow. It's about redirecting it. Redirecting it where? Peter asked. Into the mountain itself, Amy replied. The entire chamber is built on a natural focal point, a place where the Earth's own energy converges. If we could tap into that, use it to power the reversal instead of requiring a human sacrifice. The Messiah let out a howl of rage that shook loose stones from the ceiling. You know not what you speak of, it snarled. The Earth's power is wild, uncontrolled. To attempt to channel it through these ancient mechanisms would destroy not just this place, but everything for miles around. Better than letting you and your army loose on the world, Peter replied. Whitmore was studying his detonator, his face thoughtful. The charges I placed, he said slowly. They're not just in this chamber. They're throughout the mountain, placed at specific points that correspond to the natural energy lines Amy is talking about. You planned this, Peter realized. Not just to destroy the chamber, but to disrupt the entire network. It was always the backup plan, Whitmore admitted. If containment failed, if the seals were broken, the only option was to sever this site's connection to the global network permanently. Around them, the battle was intensifying. The awakened creatures were becoming more coordinated, working together to surround and overwhelm the team. Chris was bleeding from multiple wounds, and Amy was backed against the sarcophagus, using her equipment bag to fend off grasping claws. Professor, Chris called out, make the call. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now. Whitmore looked at each of them one final time. The reversal might work, he said, but even if it does, the mountain will still come down. The energy release will be too much for the geological structure to contain. But the other sites, Peter asked. If this works, if we successfully sever the connection and reverse the awakening process, it will send a shockwave through the entire network. The other Nephilim will be weakened, possibly return to dormancy. Possibly isn't good enough, Amy said, still fighting off the creatures that were trying to reach her. It's the best we can do, Whitmore replied. He began manipulating controls on his device, inputting a sequence that would initiate both the reversal process and the eventual destruction of the site. Everyone needs to be touching the sarcophagus when I activate this. The energy has to flow through all of us to work properly. Peter and Chris fought their way to the central platform, grabbing Amy and pulling her with them to the base of the sarcophagus. The Messiah itself was almost upon them now, its form a writhing mass of shadow and malevolent energy. Together, Whitmore said, placing his hand on the ancient stone. Whatever happens, we face it together. The other three joined him, their hands touching the symbols carved around the sarcophagus's base. The moment their skin made contact with the stone, Peter felt the power flowing through the chamber, ancient and terrible and utterly alien. Whitmore activated his device. The world exploded into light and sound and sensation beyond human comprehension. Peter felt the energy of the mountain flowing through him, through all of them, channeled and focused by the ancient mechanisms built into the chamber. The awakening creatures froze mid-motion as the power that had been animating them was suddenly reversed, pulled back into the stone and earth from which it had come. The Messiah let out a scream that seemed to tear reality itself, its form beginning to dissolve as the energy that sustained it was stripped away. "This is not the end," it howled as it faded. "The others will remember. They will come. The darkness will return." "Maybe," Peter gasped, feeling the power burning through his nervous system like liquid fire. "But not today." The reversal process reached its peak, and Peter felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of reality itself. Through the pain and the overwhelming sensations, he could sense the other sights around the world, could feel the shockwave as their connection to this place was severed. Ancient guardians that had been stirring in their prisons fell back into dormancy. Their awakening interrupted and their power diminished. Then the mountain began to fall. The charges that Whitmore had placed throughout the structure detonated in sequence, bringing down tons of rock and stone in a carefully orchestrated collapse. The chamber filled with dust and debris as the ceiling gave way, but somehow, miraculously, the area around the sarcophagus remained intact. When the dust settled and the rumbling stopped, Peter found himself lying on the stone floor beside the others. They were all unconscious but breathing, somehow protected by the same ancient forces they had used to reverse the awakening. The chamber around them was completely sealed, tons of rock blocking every entrance and exit, but they were alive. And more importantly, the world above was safe. Hours later, rescue teams would find them through a crack in the collapsed mountain, following the signal from emergency beacons that Chris had thought to activate before the final confrontation. They would be pulled from the ruins of the ancient chamber, battered and traumatized, but alive. The official report would classify the incident as a geological disaster, a natural cave-in triggered by the team's excavation activities. The artifacts and evidence would be confiscated by government agencies that officially didn't exist, and the site would be permanently sealed and marked as geologically unstable. But Peter knew the truth. Somewhere around the world, in 11 other locations, ancient guardians slept more deeply because of what they had done. The network that had connected them was broken, their power diminished, their eventual awakening delayed by centuries or millennia. The Order of Sacred Mysteries would continue its vigil, would continue to watch and guard and protect humanity from threats it could never understand. And Peter, Amy, and Chris would join that vigil, carrying the knowledge of what they had seen and the responsibility of ensuring it never happened again. The Messiah's thumb had been found and the prison had held, but Peter knew that their victory was only temporary. Somewhere in the darkness, ancient evils still stirred, waiting for their chance to reclaim a world they believed was rightfully theirs. The battle was won, but the war would continue forever.